Right. So I also wanted to ask you, just before we get deep into this, what has been like what has been something that you've learned about either yourself or your routine during the sort of like lockdown period? Has there been anything that you've realized, or even something that you've learned new over the past few months?
Well, I learned to work at home basically. That's we all did, right? And in that process, I learned. I used to be like on weekends, kind of more like an in-house, wearing like sweatpants, just like maybe pajamas. And I realized that for work, if I'm going to be working, I need to get into more of a mindset, so I just wake up every day, dress up as if I'm going to go to the office, put jeans, a t-shirt, and that creates, even if I'm all day at home, it feels better than if I was in pajamas and just like chilling in the couch. So that was something interesting about the lockdown period, uh, to discover that, yeah, you have to keep living, and if you're just with pajamas and just chilling, it doesn't work.
Yeah, like you said, there's a mental difference. There's a mental shift in actually like getting changed for work and getting like out of those clothes. One of my colleagues actually, she in the beginning of lockdown, I don't know if she still does it. I'd be very surprised. I'd be very proud actually if she still does it. But she actually left her flat and went for a walk around the block and then came back as a way to like. So she still like walked to work. So again, but it's that whole like that getting into the mind frame of work, so you're not just like rolling out of bed or feel like there's this weird blur
Yeah.
and life is just one long day, not being able to separate it. So that's
Yes.
quite cool.
Yeah, I think not rolling out of bed straight into work, that also helps a lot. Do something
Yeah,
before, as
yeah,
you would if you were going to the office. I think
yeah.
I'm going to try that one, to go for a walk. That sounds good, especially when it's fresh in the morning,
Hmm.
uh, before the winter at least.
Exactly. And if you live with someone, because I mean, she and her husband used to, they like would say bye and then they left and then she came back. So yeah, I think if you said that to someone before lockdown, they would think you're crazy. But I think it
Yeah.
actually helps a lot now that we can all understand it. But awesome. So before we dive into our like proper conversation, I've prepped a few quick fire questions that you couldn't prepare for. They're really easy and nothing like hectic. It's just to sort of get to know you a bit better. So I haven't thought of a good name for this, and I'm saying this way too often. I've got to think of a name for this because it's a really cool structure. But every interview I have, I'm like, I don't have a name for this yet. But anyway, so what I'm sticking with is short answers, no follow up questions. So the idea is to don't think too hard, just sort of say what comes to mind. Cool. So, first one. After a really tiring day, how do you spend your evening?
Um, I usually watch a TV show with my wife. Um, we're watching now Pokemon. Yeah.
That's
back
the
back
best.
to childhood,
Ah,
basically.
that's the best.
Yeah,
And what's a really good book that you've read recently?
a really good book. I'm reading a Haskell book, so it's quite technical.
Hmm.
One non-technical book that I read, that I really liked was, Never Split the Difference. It's a negotiation book, but yeah, I thought I was going to read it to get a better salary, but I ended up improving my relationship because it was more about like listening to people and like, having coming to an agreement than discussing salary. So it was an interesting book, and very cool stories also from the author, because he's a negotiator. And yeah.
And tea or coffee?
Coffee usually, although I also drink mate, which is an Argentinian drink, that lays in between mate and coffee. But yeah.
And how do you take it?
I'm not the expert brewer, so basically I just drink from the machine, the Nespresso thing. Yeah.
And what is one invention or app that you wish existed but doesn't?
If I knew, I would probably be working on it. So
So watch the space.
yes.
And what is something you're glad you said no to recently and why?
Well, I'm glad it was forced, but we didn't go to our country because of lockdown, and we would probably have gotten stuck there. So I think I'm glad that we didn't move the tickets before earlier just to go, because yeah, we met people that got stuck in quarantine. Yeah,
And what is something that has cost you less than 50 euros but has been the best investment most recently?
that's a hard one, because the thing I have in mind are the AirPods. I'm not an Apple user, so I bought them, but they are not
Mm.
not under 50 euros. So I don't know.
I will gladly accept AirPods. I think as someone who also has them, they've really it was one of those things in the beginning where I was like, is this worth the money? And the minute I got them, I started listening to podcasts more often. I started to like actually be more active because I could have my phone calls wherever I wanted to, really without having to worry about holding a phone.
Yes.
So I will take that. I think yes, it is maybe not within the budget that I've stipulated, but it's still a very good investment.
Yeah, and it's not even the more expensive new ones. It's just the
Right.
first model. Yeah.
But cool, thanks. That's some really interesting insight. And on that note, welcome to the OfferZen podcast. It's really cool to have you.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
So, just briefly, Christian, could you tell me a little bit about Catawiki? For anyone who hasn't really heard about the company, just some insight into like what is the problem that you solve as a company?
So Catawiki is auctions platform. So basically, people sell items in auctions, and it's all about special items. From top of my mind, things that I saw searching recently were like Barcelona T-shirt signed by Messi, or uh, the well, I don't know the team, but the one from Cristiano Ronaldo. One very old and very nice Ferrari was sold recently. So it goes from all type of things, and the idea is that to some people put very like big value in objects, in nice objects that have some meaning to them. So this is what we are all about: finding those special objects and letting people connect through them.
And what approach do you take it to solving it from a software perspective? So how do you solve that with software?
Yeah. So we solve it in two ways. One is with people. So we have a group of experts in different areas, and they are the ones curating the auctions, what items are going to go there. And we have customer solutions to just simplify the process for people as well. So that's on the people side. And on the technical side, we basically provide a platform for the clients to find these objects and to be able to sell them easily, and then to ship them, because not all the people selling are expert in selling. They're just, I have this special object, like I don't know, some relic from my grandma that I don't want anymore, and some might be interested. I need to sell it now. I need to ship it. So we help the people with the platform in this process, and we also provide the tools for the experts, our Catawiki experts, to work and facilitate the auctions. So basically providing this platform for them to work.
And how big is the company at the moment, roughly? And also, like, how big is the sort of tech team that you're working in?
So the company, I think it's around 500 or 600, probably 600 people. 200 are experts, so that's a big part of the company. The expert working on curating the auctions.
So
The
these are like
tech team,
experts in evaluating products. What makes them an expert?
yeah, in different products. So we have experts in musical instrument, in old cars, in gems, in all the categories. Basically, there is one or two experts that, yeah. So, and this is basically very passionate people. If you talk with them, they will start telling you about their area, right? So I met one of the guys that works in the music instrument, and he was all about music. He was just telling me like who he met and the pictures he took with rock bands members, like yeah. So they get really passionate about this, and basically that's what they do. Yeah. And the engineering team, you said, I think with product, also product owners and UX and everything, I think it's around 120. At least that's what the development channel is in Slack. So yeah.
Interesting. And so, I mean, you are based in Amsterdam, but I
Yes.
assume part of your development team is also then like distributed from other countries, hey?
No, we have a few people. Yeah, most of them are in Amsterdam. Now we all working from home because of yes, but the experts are scattered across Europe mostly. So there are people in Spain, in France, Italy, and the initial headquarters of Catawiki, where it was founded, is in the north of the Netherlands. So there are a few still developers that work in those offices as well. But yeah, now most of us are in Amsterdam.
Cool. And then where does your role fit in as a senior software engineer? Like, what is your main focus? What is your main, day-to-day work?
Yeah, so I work on front end, so basically all things front end. The engineering is divided in two ways. So one is vertical per domain. So I work in the logistics, sorry, in the fulfillment, which is everything after an item is sold, which is logistic shipping and payments. So in the vertical stuff, we work with backenders, with mobile engineers, UX, to basically develop new features around this area. Recently, I work on the lot submission. So basically, when people upload items to the platform, the information in the shipping section, they are integrated with different shipping providers, so they can use those prices easily. Um, Now we're working on payment things, improvement in the security of payments, these kind of things. So those are like business features or technical features that related to our domain in the platform. And then horizontally, which is very common that you have like this vertical and horizontal division. Horizontally, basically all front-end developers, we work together as a guild or as a team also on our own concerns, basically improving, keeping up with dependencies, doing interviews to hire more people, um, doing workshops together, learning new things. Yeah.
Cool. So thanks for the intro to you and your company. And so sort of moving into our conversation today, in many talks and some of the articles you've written as well, you've sort of spoken about the power of TypeScript, and that's something we're going to chat about now.
Mhm.
But interestingly, like using it beyond the basics. So you've worked with it for a while, you've introduced it at your previous company, and you're obviously now working with it at Catawiki as well. And I'm really interested to understand like what is TypeScript uniquely good at, what problems does it solve, and also like how does that look in terms of some of the stuff you do or some of the things you've done before. But just to start us off, could you like explain to me, like I'm 5 years old, what is TypeScript all about? Like what is it uniquely good at?
Yeah. So TypeScript is basically JavaScript with types, um, and that it's like a superset of JavaScript, and it brings the idea of checking types at the compile time. So there is a static process there. And what are the types? Basically, are a way to tell if my program is correct in the way I'm using my data. So I'm not mixing numbers with text or more complex things like the user object with a different object. So basically, TypeScript lets you validate all of that. It's as I said, it's a superset of JavaScript. So the goal is that it's really easy to integrate with any JavaScript application. So we add this compile time, but basically once it's compiled, it goes back to plain JavaScript, and you can run it anywhere JavaScript runs. So in the browser or with Node.js in the server, and it brings all of this type checking that can give you very nice guarantees that your code is working. And with type checking comes also some tools that help you work with the code in a more scalable way or easier way.
So what is having that sort of integration and what you were saying about compile time do for you as a developer at Catawiki? Like, how does that improve your life or improve your development?
Yeah. So by checking this type compile time, we remove a lot of the, we could even say, mean errors of JavaScript, like undefined is not a function, right? That's very common thing that happens because JavaScript only checks things at runtime. It only checks when you execute your application. So with TypeScript, we have a much faster feedback loop, and a more correct one as well, because with JavaScript you need to execute, but if your application is big, you might not execute all the code to check if everything works, right? Basically, that's what QA engineers will do. Will go through the whole every flow of your application to see that it's working, and it's not a replacement for that, but it's a much faster feedback loop because it will tell you, hey, you messed up here, you can fix it and continue the development.
So if I'm understanding it correctly, you can actually tackle, uh, for lack of a better word, like bigger projects or bigger things with TypeScript because JavaScript couldn't necessarily handle that same scale.
Yes, so because you have all these static time checking guarantees, it really shines when a project grows a lot, or when you need to refactor and come back and change the code, because you have now the confidence that if I'm changing things, they will work. Of course, there is business logic that still needs to work, and the compiler cannot check that for you. I wish it could, but and it's not in that sense a replacement for QA or for unit tests, but it's a replacement for all of these silly checks that we need to do or running the application just to see that I'm not trying to combine text with a number when it shouldn't, right?
Awesome. So I'd like to dive into like what that looks like at Catawiki in particular, but maybe you can start with just to set the context of like what actually, like what requirements from a technical perspective you have at Catawiki and why TypeScript solves those particular requirements. So just as a start, like what are some of the things you need to be able to do at Catawiki, or even like what kind of constraints are there? Um,
Yeah,
yeah, at Catawiki first.
yeah. So the way I mentioned that we have this vertical. So we have 5 verticals, and 3 of them are user or client facing. The other 2 are more internal things and infrastructure. And each vertical has 2 or 3 teams. So we have all these different teams working on different areas of the platform. People working for the buyer side, where we work on the search of items, or the bidding page where you are bidding on an auction, or the seller side where you want people to be able to input the product into the platform, get their money back when the item is sold. And this is separated in different services. We could say like microservice architecture, right? And not only on the backend side, but also on the front end side. And you have teams that work, for example, let's say on the seller at the buyer page, that work all the time there, refining features and new things. And then you have teams like my team where shipping features are scattered across the different flows. So as a seller, I need to input shipping information, but then as a buyer, I want to see the tracking code when I bought the item. So our features are more scattered. So in our case, it's not that we work on the same code base all day, but we work in different code bases all the time. So where TypeScript come in really useful is for the teams that work a lot on the same place, they will be kind of like changing the same code or coming back to the same code very often and working together. So you want this to be a smooth process, right? In for the other teams that we need to go to code bases that we might not be so familiar with, it's TypeScript make it easier to discover this code base and to make sure that we are not adding a shipping button but also breaking other things, right? So I think depending on like your team, yeah, there are different benefits, but they're all related to it.
So it sort of helps you work across different code bases, right?
Yes, that's one way basically, and there are code bases that we change less frequently, and we go back maybe a few months later, and you still need to. You won't remember by heart everything, right? So it helps you get up to speed with that. And for the more active code bases, the bigger ones where more people is working, you need them to scale properly, and then you also want them to be easy to work with in this setup where there is a lot of maybe different team working on the same thing.
Cool. So maybe now's a good time to just get a little bit more technical than we have been before. But what are some of the features of TypeScript that allow that kind of thing, like the scalability or allowing many teams to work on the same thing? What are some of the features within TypeScript that enable that, I guess?
Yeah. So it goes back goes back to basically the time checking that TypeScript does. And basically there is a spectrum of how strict you might work strictly you might work with TypeScript. You might disable strict mode and resemble more like JavaScript in a way, and then you have less guarantees. Or if you enable strict mode, it will do a few more checks for you. And then you can also, because you can use JavaScript in TypeScript, and that part will not be type checked, or you can basically opt out of the type checking. So there is this spectrum. Do I go all in, or do we just make it more loosely? And it depends on your needs. I personally like to make it more strict. So the more I can represent with types, and then the compiler will tell me that things are failing. So, for example, if one thing I wrote about is try to encode the state of a asynchronous operation. So I get some data from the server and I show it to the user. There are 4 states that it can be in. So it can be either idle, we haven't made any communication with the server yet, we need to show something to the user in that state. Then we fire the request, it's loading, and then when it resolves, it can either fail for some error or it can succeed, and then we have the data to show to the user. And if you encode that in a way that you allow the types to make it valid, you prevent some inconsistent mistakes, like your data being like having an error and a success at the same time. So what then is the valid thing to show to the user? So if you use some of the features of TypeScript like discriminated unions, you can then basically let the compiler discriminate for you what the state your code needs to be in. Another example of this will be having the compiler to check that you are not working with an empty list. For example, if you are showing a list of things and it shouldn't be empty, let's say it's a list of currencies, and there has to be at least one currency that the user can pay with. So I can check that I'm not working with an empty list, because the list is empty, there will be nothing inside to show to the user. And those areas is where I like to go a bit the extra mile, and find ways not only with TypeScript at the compile time, but also in the runtime to check these things and cover those edge cases that might otherwise blow up in runtime when the user is checking the application.
Cool. So yeah, so it seems like there are some things that I like the way you put it just now, that there's like TypeScript almost gives you that spectrum from loose to strict, where you may not necessarily have that same customer, I guess, like customization option with something like JavaScript, because as you said, this is like a superset, or like one level above that, which is really cool. And out of curiosity, because you mentioned that you introduced TypeScript at your previous company. Um, was it for a similar reason that you needed TypeScript to solve something, or what was the thing that TypeScript was solving in that case?
Yeah. So in that case, we had, at least on the front end side, we didn't have these different services. We have a single application for the whole website, and it was quite big. So it was hard to go back to some things that, after 6 months, we need to check edit some page again, and then we are having trouble catching up with what was the state at that time. And we thought that basically TypeScript could help us with that. So it was kind of an organic decision. We thought it was a good idea. We introduced it, and actually it proved the point. Yeah, so it was quite an organic process, but the reason to was the same, to solve this problem of scaling an application that was becoming quite big to remember about all in one person's head, right?
So how does this look in terms of your own software processes at Catawiki? So could you just maybe like give, if you have a particular example that we haven't spoken about already, um, where you use TypeScript just beyond the basics? Like what is that?
Mhm.
How has that looked for you?
Yeah. So one thing that I introduced in my team is, it's not particular to TypeScript per se, but it goes along. It's a library to do the checks that TypeScript cannot do statically, to do them on runtime. So, for example, when you get some information from the server, uh, because this will happen at runtime, TypeScript cannot check it. And this is one of those more flexible areas where you can either say, this is whatever, and just trust me that this will be what I'm telling you to the compiler, and it will be okay. But then we might make a mistake. A value that should be always be some text might not be there because it's actually optional. Um, so what we added in my team is a way to check that in the runtime. So, and then we build this kind of like gateway between the dynamic data that comes from the server. We check it, and we have the guarantees that if it's invalid, we are covering those cases. And I guess the success story was that the first day we pushed that to production, we got one error reported in the system where we sent the runtime error saying that there was some invalid data, that it should be text, but it wasn't. So we fixed that, but it was kind of like the confirmation thing, because it was the very same day, right?
Right. And
And
that would have slipped through the cracks if you
yes,
hadn't set that
yes,
up.
yeah, exactly. So um, if we would be doing the normal way of basically just telling TypeScript to trust that this user object, for example, has all these properties, and we can work as if it was type checked, um, we will have gotten some runtime error, and the user will see some bad experience. But yeah, we were able to validate on runtime that, and show an alternate, yeah, UI or some feedback to the user that something went wrong and they could try again.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's really cool. That speaks to what you were saying earlier about it it allowing you to do more checks than you would have been able to do before without that. So that's really cool.
Yeah, and just maybe to be clear, so this it's a specific library, it's not a TypeScript thing, and there are several flavors of this. So there are things like more in the functional programming style, which is what we are trying to use here, and the library is called IOTS. But there are all other flavors for people that like more object-oriented style as well. So if like you search for runtime type validation in TypeScript, you will find several of these libraries.
And what is something you've learned through using TypeScript as a way of making sure that you're using it as effectively as you can? Like, is there something that you've added to your, I guess, the way you approach a certain problem with TypeScript or your workflow as a developer? Are there any sort of like hacks or tips that you have in that regard?
I think so. I started to work with TypeScript probably 3 years and a half ago, and it was part of the process of me trying to go from just JavaScript to learning other languages. In this process, I've been learning not only TypeScript, but I mentioned I was reading the Haskell book or Golang or some other languages, and I got really interested into this topic of static type checking, and I found in this learning process that there are other languages that take this quite even farther than what we do in TypeScript. And basically, I brought from there some ideas to go the extra mile and to be more strict and adding more constraint to your types, but in a way that they can liberate you from committing the mistakes that you will be committing otherwise. Right? So one thing that changed in the way I write code or develop application is that it's more like compiler oriented. So instead of having my application running and this is quite unexpected for a front end developer, right? Where you normally just make some changes. I want to see them live. So the process for me looks more like I write some code and I check if the types are right, then I can continue. And it's basically a loop of adding some more types and some more code and see if it's valid and continue like that. And eventually, of course, it's front end, so you need to run it, you need to see it working, but it can go much farther than normally would. Yeah,
So I mean, that sounds like it frees up a lot of your sort of your time and your mind share in that regard. There's like less things for you to think about because there's
exactly,
it
exactly.
takes care of those things, which is
Yeah,
really cool.
and yeah, it's quite cool, and it's actually yeah, as you said, that like I can free my mind for a lot of things that the compiler can check for me. So it's kind of like some people, when they think about using a statically typed language, they think about these ugly errors that are hard to understand. Like you didn't like you can use the metaphor that the compiler is screaming at you with errors. But if you think about it from like pair programming metaphor, like I'm just coding together with the compiler, and he's trying to tell me that I either messed up here and I can change things. So it's really freeing your mind, and you are having to rely less on your mind and more on the computer,
Yeah,
which will get it right for you.
that's cool. I like the way you describe it now. It's like you're like changing your relationship to the compiler. You're like it's now your friend. You're like
Yes.
pair programming with it. That's really interesting. So just as a sort of as a last or closing thought for anyone who's either hasn't ever like really I guess experimented with TypeScript or has been thinking about introducing it into their team or at their company. What is some of the advice you have for like a really good first step, either in terms of how you pitch it to your team or to your company, or even some of the first steps you can take to actually implementing it?
Yeah. Because as I mentioned, TypeScript is a superset. It's really easy to get started with it. You can configure Webpack to run together with TypeScript, and then you start moving like one file at a time to TypeScript. all it takes is just changing the extension for .gs to .ts, and that's it, basically. And the step of checking the types and the step of producing your compiled code, your JavaScript that can run, it's independent from each other. So you can still compile invalid code, and you can just send it to production if you want. So in the case like you move it to JavaScript, you move your JavaScript to TypeScript, it will give you some type errors. You can still use that code in production, and slowly start fixing those type errors and slowly benefiting from it. So for people coming from JavaScript, you need to invest a bit on learning, and especially learning like how to use it with the libraries you're using. So how to use it with React or how to use it with Node.js, right? So there is some investment in that, and if you want to introduce it in your company, you have to be the person that will drive this effort, right? To teach it to others or be there to help pair programming your colleagues that are getting familiar with this. If you
And
come
what's
from other
a
background,
good
sorry.
way, just on learning TypeScript, what's a good way to learn it? Are there like certain resources that have helped you in the past?
Um, the TypeScript website has some good resources. There is a handbook, and it's kind of like the specifications. So you go around like the different features that the language has, and the only downside of that is it's kind of hard to connect. Like, why do I need this, or where I will use it? Eventually, you will figure it out. Like, okay, I oh, that's for this, right? So that feature can help me with this. But initially, you might want to find some guide for using TypeScript with the library you're using. So if you work with React or with Vue, find a good guide to work with that. And yeah, it's easy to get started because it's optional, so you can add as much as you want progressively. So
Cool, yeah. And then you were just saying about if you don't have JavaScript at your, or you don't use JavaScript
yeah,
at your
if you
company.
don't use JavaScript and you come from like another background and you want to get into Node.js or for front end, it's probably easier because you might already know how to use a statically typed language. If you come from C# or Java, uh, you probably just want to know like how my knowledge translates into TypeScript. So it's probably going to be easier.
Well, thanks. I think you've given some really cool insights into using TypeScript and also from your own experience. So appreciate you sharing all of that. And I'm sure if someone does still have any questions about TypeScript in particular, or even is interested in some of the stuff you were talking about, is there somewhere online that they can find you in particular?
I guess Twitter is the easier way. They can just send me a message. I think I have the DMs open,
Cool.
so they can ask me there, or just tweet at me.
Cool.
Yeah.
I will. Yeah, I will link that in the description of this episode in any case, so people can feel free to find you there. But otherwise, yeah, thanks so much for being here on the podcast today and sharing with us. It's really nice to hear from you.
Hey, it was great, and I encourage people to get like to try TypeScript out and to see the benefits. And if you like it, perfect. If it doesn't work for you, of course, it's also perfect. Companies are looking for people working with TypeScript. I have friends that recently were like looking for jobs, and they mentioned specifically that it's one of the requirements, at least for front-end jobs. Like many companies are using it now. It became quite popular in like the Stack Overflow survey was and the popularity was increasing a lot. So it's a good time to learn it.
Yeah, and I mean, just from what you've said, it sounds like there are good, like there is logic that you can apply from TypeScript in other languages or other problems. So even just learning it will probably help you with some of that as well. So that's quite
Indeed.
exciting. Cool. Well, thanks, dude. We'll hopefully chat soon again.
Indeed. Thank you.